Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be back here and to be steeping myself in crime. Rachel referred to the fact that some of you, even after a couple of days of, I hope, enlightening discussions, might still be hungry for crime. And crime writing does produce, it seems, a peculiar hunger. The first sight I saw when I entered my very pleasant hotel room was a television guide, a German television guide on the desk in front of me, which said in very large red letters on its cover, "Neue Stoffe für Krimi-Fans." Forgive my pronunciation, but I think that's a sentence which you don't have to know any German to understand. And yet that, as I hope we will explore in the next couple of days, that popular hunger for crime also is a literary hunger, and I'll be talking to, but also Cordelia Borchardt will be talking to some writers who are writing about crime now. But as we can see from the image of great British creativity looming over us, even Benedict Cumberbatch's fortunes depend a little bit on crime, don't they? And there's probably no greater avatar of British culture than the person that he impersonates there, Sherlock Holmes, because in a literary way, one of the reasons I think that this is the one bit I get a chance to say something, so you have to be patient. It will only be very brief. One of the great and interesting facts about crime writing is that it also reaches backwards, of course. It's no accident that the person whose writings we explored 4 or 5 years ago in Berlin, Charles Dickens, was the writer who first coined the phrase detective story. Did you know that? Well, anyway, there you go. That's my one contribution to knowledge. And I sometimes think of that extraordinary moment in Great Expectations where Pip, who's just met Estella, sees some convicts being put in a carriage, and to his horror he recognizes one of them, and he recoils from the sight, and he says in the narrative, "Why is it that I find myself always surrounded by the taint of crime?" He wants to be a gentleman, of course. He wants to be clean and prosperous and to be married to Estella. And I think Dickens saw something which we keep rediscovering in English fiction, that somehow crime is at the heart of what a lot of the most interesting fiction seems to be about. So that's my little academic bit. I'm going to say a few things that I hope will embarrass Philip a bit now about him, because it's wonderful we have him to hear. He said he's going to be brutally honest in response to, first of all, my questions, and I hope your questions later, to discuss crime writing. Because in a way, actually, it's interesting that he exemplifies that kind of crossover between what's already been referred to as sort of genre fiction. If you go into a British bookshop, big British bookshop, crime's in a special room. And what sometimes gets called literature or literary fiction. And of course, as some of you might know, in 1993, Philip was there as one of the kind of group of the Granters 20 best young, you were young then, Philip, 20 best young British novelists. Do you remember that? And lining up with Kazuo Ishiguro.
I remember it, yeah. It was like having a sign around your neck saying, "Kick me." Because no one really liked us, actually.
Well, it seems that that's one of the signs, it seems to me, that, because of course Philip had already started writing his Bernie Gunter novels then, that the British at least do sort of realise that crime writing and literature are categories which overlap a great deal rather than being sort of mutually exclusive. Of course, Philip has written lots of other different kinds of books, including children's books and lots of other different kinds of novels. But today we're going to talk mainly about his Bernie Gunther novels and about his most recent one, The Lady from Zagreb. But you'll all get a chance to ask questions in a little while, and you're allowed to ask him about any of them, aren't you? Because there are probably people here who have a more encyclopedic knowledge even than me. And I suppose I wanted to start, Philip, by asking the question about what is so distinctive about these as crime novels compared to other people's crime novels, which is time and place, where they are and when they are, and what it was, whether it was a sort of whim or quite a sort of carefully thought out decision that you first, in the late 1980s, decided to take crime writing to 1930s Berlin.
Well, first of all, let me apologize to all of you. There's nothing, I think, quite as disappointing as seeing an author in the flesh. And we always let people down, I think, because it's in the nature of what we do to be less impressive than what we write. The author is a living, breathing human being in front of an audience is a kind of fish out of water, really. So, first of all, let me apologize for being me and not being Bernie Gunther, who's infinitely more interesting than I could or ever will be. I remember thinking about writing about Berlin. It wasn't so much I wanted to write about crime. I wanted to write about Berlin, actually. Because many of the people I really admired had done so already, and they were people like Isherwood, W.H. Auden, John le Carré, Nabokov, Len Deighton. And it seemed to me, actually, that Berlin was somewhere where you could go and write a book, and you didn't actually have to come from Berlin for a start. And in a sense, all of those people kind of invented Berlin. In fact, I'll go even a stage further. I think the British kind of invented it, really. Because, I mean, if you look at, say, Isherwood, I mean, a lot of our ideas of what Berlin was like for a long time comes from the pages of Isherwood. We think of it as a kind of slightly decadent place where there are some very strong, determined women and some slightly, effeminate men. In fact, I mean, Isherwood and Auden came here for cheap sex. That was why they came in the beginning, where the prostitution in the 20s in Weimar was out of control. So they came here for cheap sex. I'm not sure why Lou Reed and Bowie came here. But of course, you come to Berlin with your own idea of what Berlin is in your own head. And so I thought, well, there was nothing to stop me from doing exactly the same. Although at the time when I decided I was going to write about Berlin, I'd never even been. But it just represented something really important in my mind, and I don't think that's changed at all, actually. So, also, I think I like to start writing from a position of complete ignorance. Actually, I think it's a really good place for an author to start, because then you think, well, I should go there, I should have impressions, I should write something down, I should research the place. And I remember when I first came to Berlin, I spent weeks tramping around with a notebook in my hand, and to some extent it felt like I was indeed a kind of detective, because at that particular time there was hardly any information published about what it was like to be an ordinary German in the 30s, which was really what I was interested in, was to try and explore the mindset of people whose country had been hijacked by a bunch of gangsters. So I hadn't actually really intended to write a crime novel, so much as the fact that I wanted to write about a place and a time, and I kind of backed into the world of crime writing almost through the back door. So that's how it sort of started, really.
I wonder, I mean, there is a sort of subgenre, you may not think you belong to it, I don't know, of historical mystery stories. And again, it has very popular forms, but also quite highfalutin ones. You know, Umberto Eco and Orhan Pamuk have written historical whodunits. I just wonder if maybe what you were saying, your interest was really in the history. That a crime book is a crime story is a good way of finding out about stuff, isn't it? Because in effect, your detective has to do that almost on our behalf. So you get to, certainly reading the Bernie Gunther novels I've read, I thought I knew quite a lot about Nazism, but there's a lot of stuff. I mean, in the most recent one, I suddenly thought, yes, what happened to Switzerland in the war? And I didn't know anything about that. Why didn't they invade Switzerland? Were there plans to invade Switzerland? So it's a kind of thing that the detective finds out stuff for the reader, in a way.
Well, I think, yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, having decided to write about a detective, I realized a detective was actually a pretty good way of exploring a lot of really important moral issues. I mean, if I'd written about an insurance salesman, it probably wouldn't have been nearly as interesting. I thought a detective, a cop, is really at the sharp end of what's happening. And especially when I started to look at the history of the Berlin police, how your politics could get you kicked out. I mean, the guy who was the head of the criminal police in 1932 was a man called Bernhard Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, Bernhard Weiss. And he was Jewish, and he'd earned the enmity of Goebbels and the Nazis simply by virtue of the fact that he was a Jew. He was an extremely good policeman. He was one of the most modern policemen in the whole of Europe, but he had to flee Berlin in 1932 in a laundry van. And he hid in an embassy somewhere. I think it might even have been the Chinese embassy for a couple of days. And then he was taken into the Adlon Hotel and then sneaked out from the Adlon. And so your politics as a policeman could get you killed. And so this seemed to me to sort of really be fascinating, the idea that a policeman had to watch his politics. But more importantly than that, it meant also that whatever crime I could describe, which, if you like, was happening on the front of the stage, there was an even bigger crime happening at the back of the stage, which was added a kind of operatic echo to the whole thing. And it meant I could deal with a kind of parochial murder, if you like, while in the background the crime of the millennium is taking place. So this meant made for some fabulous ironies and sort of things that you just couldn't make up. I mean, for instance, in The Lady from Zagreb, there's a true description of the International Criminal Crime Conference of 1942, because the Nazis were in charge of Interpol. The head of Interpol until his assassination was Reinhard Heydrich. And the Germans thought they were going to win the war. Consequently, it seemed perfectly acceptable that they should host the International Crime Conference. They invited people from Switzerland, Sweden, France, all over Europe, everywhere except England, actually, probably, for obvious reasons. And this was only 6 months after the Wannsee Conference. They even the Nazis even hosted the crime conference in the same building as the Wannsee Conference. And they talked about things like, forensic techniques, detectives do this and detectives do that. And it just struck me as absolutely fascinating, this should actually take place. They also had a thing called the German War Crimes Bureau. Because now, of course, we believe, especially the English, we're fabulous at occupying moral high ground. I mean, it's like we never committed a war crime in our lives, which of course we did. But the Nazis had the International War Crimes Bureau, and it was there to investigate crimes that were considered to be sort of war crimes, things like torpedoing a hospital ship or rape and murder of a peasant girl or something like that. And the Wehrmacht, of course, the Wehrmacht had a very strong sense of their own honor, and they didn't want really much to do with the sort of things that the SS were doing. So they thought it would be one way of preserving their sort of moral integrity would be to have a war crimes bureau. So I love these things that history throws up, these little details, because I mean you can virtually get a whole novel out of something like, you know, the International Crime Conference at the Wannsee Villa in 1942. I mean, I got several chapters out of it as it happened. And as you walked in, the first thing you saw apparently was a postage stamp, a large blow-up of a postage stamp featuring the head of Reinhard Heydrich, who'd been murdered in Prague only a sort of few months before. So again, you can't make these things up, actually. So, and the people making the speeches, one of them was General Arthur Neighbor, who'd just come back from northern Ukraine, where he'd helped murder 40,000 people. So I guess he knew a bit about sort of international crime, really, when you think about it.
I mean, you're obviously interested in that because Bernie has quite a good lunch, and we do too, in a way, with Arthur Neighbor quite early on in the novel. And he's quite good company, and he's quite amusing, civilized conversationalist. And he's not all weird and scary like Heydrich. He sort of says, well,
nor was Heydrich, really.
But
I mean, the thing is, you've got to make these people come alive, and that means you have to discover them as human beings, I think. I mean, it's too easy to paint them as monsters and animals. In actual fact, I think by spending time with them as people, in a sense that what they did becomes even more horrific, I think, actually, more cynical. So I don't like to sort of paint them as monsters. And you know, it's fair to say, I mean, for instance, there's a lot about Goebbels in this particular book. Now, Goebbels was a highly intelligent man and good company and funny. And indeed, he was a novelist, which is another reason I'm sort of fascinated with him, because before he became the Minister of Propaganda and Minister of Truth and Propaganda, he was a novelist, having done his postgraduate degree in literature. He wrote a novel called Michael, which of course didn't get published. So immediately there's something another novelist can have in common with Goebbels, is not being published. But of course, once you are the Minister of Truth and Propaganda, then it becomes a lot easier to get your novel published. And another thing that really does fascinate me about all of these guys is they loved, we come back to the idea of crime, the crime novel. They loved crime novels. Heydrich got his job because he was a fan of spy and crime literature. He got sacked from the Navy because he basically got the Admiral's daughter pregnant. And he then subsequently married, and he was looking for a job, and his wife, who was actually the die-hard Nazi, she said, I've heard about this organization called the SS, and I think you ought to go for an interview with this man I know called Himmler. So he went for an interview to meet Himmler, and Himmler thought he was interviewing somebody who had been in naval intelligence, and he wasn't. But he had read a lot of spy novels. And so Himmler's thinking, God, this guy really knows his stuff, But actually, he got it all from books. So, in a sense, when I came to write about Heydrich, I sort of felt I was kind of closing the circle, actually. It was someone who'd got his job by virtue of reading the kind of stuff that I write.
Does that, I mean, there's lots of ironic opportunities. I wonder what also the sort of tricky things are, particularly when you're writing your detective, because I was struck, I read again the first Bernie Gunther novel, March Violets, and to put it very crudely, it's not so difficult for Bernie to be quite a good bloke in that novel. It's 1936, the Olympics are taking place, he still has Jewish clients, he doesn't like the Nazis, and only right at the end of the novel, when he meets Heydrich for the first time, does he sort of become a client of them. By the most recent one, the lady from Zagreb, he's in the Sicherheitsdienst. And it must be more difficult for you, just almost plot-wise, to have him survive, continue to be the same, essentially irreverent, skeptical character he is, and also maintain the reader's sympathy. I mean, hasn't it become more difficult?
Oh yeah, it's enormously difficult. I mean, the point is to paint oneself into a corner, always, to make it difficult for the writer. Because if I don't make it difficult for myself, then I don't feel the books have any worth or validity. So it's equally, I hate the idea of heroes anyway. I don't really believe in heroes. I don't trust them. I think heroes are invariably villains on another day. And that's one of the things that drives newspapers, it seems to me, is that, you know, yesterday's hero is often today's villain. So I like to create a kind of moral difficulty for him again and again. I like to sort of for him to really wonder what the right thing to do is, find it difficult to know what the right thing to do is. Sometimes he doesn't actually do the right thing. He knows that. But these are interesting people to write about, because if you write about people who always do the right thing, who are always decent, moral, crusaders for truth, etc., number one, they wouldn't survive very long, but equally they're not very interesting to write about. It's much more interesting to write about people who are conflicted, you know, full of doubt, melancholic. I mean, kind of like me, really. I mean, I'm writing about myself half the time. I am, you know, conflicted, pessimistic, melancholy, bitter sense of humor. I mean, in a way, his only source of revolution and resistance is his sense of humor, which is very wry. People sometimes say to me, well, could you survive then if you weren't in the Nazi Party and you were in the police? Well, yes, you could. I mean, there were lots of people who never joined the Nazi Party. One of the top detectives, who was a man called Ernst Gnat, never joined the Nazi Party. Little known fact, I mean, Mullan, who was the chief of the Gestapo, never joined the Nazi Party. Of course, you know, if you're the chief of the Gestapo, then maybe you don't have to. But at the same time, there were an awful lot of people today who believed that Mullan was a communist spy, and indeed he was a member of the Communist Party in the early 1920s. I mean, the Nazis had a great facility for using people when it suited them, and just ignoring the fact that their politics were a bit dodgy. I mean, it's like when someone came to Goering and pointed out that his deputy, Erhard Milch, was married to a Jew. And wasn't this a bit, you know, this conflicted with Nazis? And he hammered the chair and said, I decide who's Jewish. And that sums it up, really. It's like, you know, if someone was good at their job and useful, then there was, you know, hypocrisy meant these things could be ignored sometimes, and it's that. So it is with Bernie Gunther, because sometimes, and in one of the books, Heydrich actually spells it out. He says, "Look, I'm pretty sure that the person who committed, and I want the person caught. But if I just let any ordinary policeman run at this case, they'll just fit up some poor Jew, and that's what we'll end up with." So it was useful for them to have people who weren't just paying lip service to the politics.
But I mean, he may be you, but he's a bit Philip Marlowe as well, isn't he? A little bit, and he does in increasingly difficult circumstances. He tries to, not to be heroic, he's not a heroic character, but he tries to do the right thing, as they say, doesn't he? And he does, I don't know if Raymond Chandler was sometimes on your mind when you were starting this series, but I think a lot a lot of readers like me would be reminded of that. Underneath the show of cynicism, the reader can be confident that this person, down these mean streets a man must go who's not himself mean, that there is that contract with the reader.
Well, when I first started writing, I had a little bit of Chandler at the front of my mind, and I sort of wondered what would have happened if Chandler, when he'd left his English public school, which was Dulwich College, if instead of going to live in Los Angeles, he'd come to live in Berlin, like sort of Isherwood and Spender and etc. I thought, what kind of detective novels would he actually have written? And of course, he would eventually have written about the Nazis. You see, I kind of think I'm much luckier than he was, because all he was able to write about were a few bent sort of mayors and corrupt governors and casino owners and gangsters. I mean, the Nazis are some of the worst characters in the world to write about. It's like Chandler himself says, when I run out of an idea, I have a man walking through the door with a gun in his hand. Well, I do the same, but I have a man walking through a door who's a real-life Nazi, who's a famous Nazi as well. And they're fantastic characters to write about. They're much more interesting than any villain I could invent myself, because they are full of complexity and they're full of ambiguity. I mean, as I say, people forget. You see, Hitler was a rock star in the 1930s. I mean, people had shrines to Hitler in their houses. They got rid of the family Bible and put a copy of Mein Kampf underneath a picture of Hitler. People forgot how fantastic they thought Hitler was. People went nuts for Hitler. So just as we do in Britain now, to sort of paint him as just a kind of carpet-chewing nutcase doesn't actually explain very much. And that's the point for me. It's always to try and understand. It's my own little mini university course in kind of what would I have done? And each book is a kind of question mark. What would I have done? And so by putting myself in an increasingly difficult situation, it becomes a much more challenging question. And to be honest, I'm not always sure I would have done the right thing. We all like to think we would have been heroic resistance figures like Sophie Scholl, but I don't think I think survival would have dictated a lot of what we do. So I like to force myself to look at my own reflection in the mirror and say, what would you have done? And sometimes it's uncomfortable because the answers are uncomfortable.
Bern is certainly not heroic, but he's quite rebellious, isn't he? I mean, there's one gratuitous moment, gratuitous of you and of him, where I think he's in one of the Nazi ministries. He's in an official building, and there's a room with a huge radio in it. Yeah, and he tunes it to the BBC and puts it on full volume and then switches it on, and because the valves take quite a long time to warm up, he's out in the building before everybody in the building's going to hear this. No, you didn't have to do that, and he didn't have to do that. So you do want to preserve for him a kind of, rather sort of risky tendency to sort of, not just to, in his heart, to dislike the Nazis, but actually to do slightly more than that.
Well, first of all, I'm a natural anarchist. That's one easy explanation for that. I trained as a lawyer, and there's nothing like training as a lawyer to turn you into an anarchist, actually, and to sort of think, gosh, there are far too many lawyers in the world, aren't there? And that's what I told myself for the 5 odd years that I studied law. So it's the sort of thing, yes, I probably would have done myself, and probably would have, paid the price. But to come back to the idea of crime as well, I mean, I sort of think I'm very lucky that I've had a good education, because I think but for that, I probably would have been a criminal, because there's something I find seductive about crime. I had to write an article for The Times recently about I think it was I had to write something that I felt slightly ashamed about, and it was when I had a brief time in accountancy. I've had lots and lots of jobs, by the way. I mean, dozens of jobs, which I think is jolly useful if you're going to be a writer, to have been employed in one thing and one thing after another. And it was so boring that I planned a robbery in detail, and I spent days planning this robbery because the audit room where we did the audit, and I was there on my own most of the time, was once a week was where the wages were counted. And one day I just counted up all the wage slips and all the bits of paper that had wrapped the money, and I calculated there was something like 150,000 quid. And so I actually planned the robbery and my getaway and everything. And I'm not sure whether I would have gone through with it, but on the day that I thought I might have gone through with it, they went over to direct payments into the bank, actually. And so they moved off cash altogether. But no, I had my father's gun, I had the getaway car, I had the mask I was going to wear, I had the place I was going to go. So I think I'm just lucky that I had a decent education that sort of stopped me from being a criminal.
But robbery, I mean, the British love robbers, don't they? I mean, as the most recent sort of true crime story has shown, that I think most people probably think that if you talk about a crime novel, essentially you're talking about a novel that's got to have at least one murder in it, because robbery
But you've got to commit a crime in a way to write about it really well. You've actually got to, it's like method acting. I think, I mean, Val's sitting there, and I know Val probably would agree with me. In a way, you've got to sort of get your head into the head of a murderer. You've got to kind of do it a bit yourself, actually. And you've got to put yourself in situations that you wouldn't put yourself in if you were a normal person, really. I mean, I remember I'd spent weeks in Russia once researching something, and I went to see murder scenes and autopsies and stuff like that. And I remember speaking to P.G. James about it. It was a lovely lady. But I said, have you never really seen an autopsy or anything like that, Phyllis? And she said, oh, no, I don't think I'd want to see that. And I thought, well, really, how can you write about it? Well, I suppose you can, because it's called an imagination. And she had a great imagination. But for me, I like to sort of have that kind of Robert De Niro drive a taxi around New York before I actually play a taxi driver in New York. For me, I have to kind of go to the place and live it a bit in order to actually write about it.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was going to ask you about research. I remember once doing an interview with Ruth Rendell about a novel, a crime novel of hers, and which was set in a particular area of northwest London. Fictional street names, but you could sort of recognize it. And I said to her rather thoughtlessly, well, I sort of can imagine you walking round and round, and she said, that's exactly what I did. That's it. And this terrifying thought that somebody perhaps going out to the shop to buy a newspaper might come upon Ruth Rendell stalking round these suburban streets with a notepad in hand. But that's obviously kind of, and there's such a close connection between places and crime scenes. That's obviously part of the research you do. I mean, what other kinds of research do you do?
I think the most important research I do is emotional research. Increasingly, I don't take any pictures, I don't write anything down. What I'm looking for is the feeling, and I'll give you a good example. And well, I went in all my researches. I'd heard of you've heard of concentration camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka and Belsen, and again and again, this name kept coming up, and I'd never heard of it. I didn't know where it was. It was called Jasenovac. And it was that name that got me into the idea of writing about Zagreb, because it turned out it was a concentration camp in the former Yugoslavia, and which was a fascist country run by the Ustaše, which was a puppet regime of the Nazis. And Himmler encouraged the Ustache to murder their Jews, and they did, and they ran out of Jews pretty quickly. And then someone said, who do we really hate now that we've killed all the Jews? And someone said, Serbs. So they started killing Serbs by the thousand. And this is where this awful camp called Jasenovac. So I went to Jasenovac, which was a kind of epic journey in itself. And I wrote, in a way, going there was a feeling what it was like to go there, sort of informed the book. It became a kind of heart of darkness experience for me to drive to this place. And then when I got there, it was this vast open field with a kind of hideous modern memorial to the dead. But the real memorial was a train that was parked in this place where people had been ferried to their deaths. And I got on the train. There was nobody else there. I got on the train into the car and I just stood there for about half an hour. And I'm not a religious man. Well, not really. I mean, I believe in God, but I hate him, which is different. And I just I said a sort of silent prayer, if you like, to all these people who had been there. And it was like, look, I'm going to write about this, and please, I'm not going to take this lightly. I'm going to deal with it in no trivial way. It really affected me, just sort of trying to find the feelings. So I wasn't writing anything down. It was like to have the feelings. And in a way, that's the real research for me, is to have the feelings. And and it sounds sued and melodramatic and mendacious even, but to some extent, I've now got to the stage where I sort of feel I'm suffering from a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder from what I've written, because I've been writing about this for so long now, and I sort of feel it's started to sort of impact on me as a person. And so that's really what I'm looking for when I write. It's not, the little gem facts, although those are there. Because I like to think I'm a bit like an impressionist painter, and I'm not really interested in the huge chunky bits of research. It's the little spots of detail that I want, because it's the tiny little things that are interesting. Because if you remember, like a painting by Seurat, none of these little spots means anything at all when you're up close. But when you take 10 steps back, the whole thing starts to sort of shimmer. And it becomes a moment in time. It's an impression. And that's really all I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to deliver a kind of photographic experience, because that would be impossible. But what I am trying to do is create an impression. And the best way of doing that is for me to sort of record the small things and to feel the stuff as well.
And when Bernie goes to Yugoslavia, he meets one of these real-life personages who come into your novels. He meets Kurt Waldheim. And I mean, you laugh, but I mean, there's almost a comic aspect to it, isn't there? That a kind of dramatic irony that Bernie just meets him as if he were another Wehrmacht officer, and we meet him as a kind of, I guess, as a sign of what you were talking about earlier. How do unheroic people behave?
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that really shocked me about that whole Yugoslavian thing was to discover the role of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, the people who were carrying out literally brutal murders by the hundred on a day-by-day basis were Roman Catholic priests. And 2 of them had the nicknames of the Angels of Death, and they would compete with each other to see how many throats they could cut in one day. So for every... I mean, the point is, there are so many horrible things in my books that I have to find comic things to put in as well, to sort of get the reader through, to get the writer through, quite frankly. I mean, if it wasn't for some of the jokes and the the humour of the character, I mean, you'd kill yourself, really. For me, it's, you know, I mean, and also people, especially in England, they sort of say, well, you know, would people have made jokes like that, and would they have had a sense of humour? And the English don't believe Germans have a sense of humour, you see. And, you know, I said, well, come to Berlin. Berliners have got one of the most fantastic senses of humour in the world, in my opinion. It chimes with my own sense of humour because it's very cruel. So the things that make Berliners...
True? They're all very cruel, are they? Yeah.
The sense of humour is right. I mean, come on, you all know what I'm talking about. It's like, you know, the customer's always right, except in Berlin. Which makes for quite a lot of comedy, I think, actually. So, and remember, we all remember that wonderful film Cabaret with Joel Grey, who played the MC in the club, and God, the brittle, sharp, razor-sharp humour of the wonderful songs, but also that character. I mean, Lawrence Kasdan, who wrote that script, was a genius, in my opinion. And he got the sensibility of Berlin perfectly, absolutely perfectly. And even to the extent of writing a Jew writing a Nazi song, because they thought what we'd really like to do in this film is put the Horst Wessel song in, but of course if we put that in, we'll never be able to show it in Germany. So he said, I know, we'll write our own. And where this song, Tomorrow Belongs to Me, comes in, it sounds like a real Nazi song. It's a piece of absolute genius, this film, in my opinion. But how did I get onto that subject?
Humour in dark times, yes. We talked a bit about the detective. I just wanted to get just away from the history a second and ask, in what particular ways, because I think crime writers are quite often very aware of traditions and conventions of crime writing. And we talked a bit about Raymond Chandler. But are you consciously using certain conventions and formulae which you think you've got to respect because it's respecting the reader to do so?
I think the conventions are much larger than the genre. That's all I can say is... Graham Greene was a great fan of detective novels. He loved detective novels, especially Victorian ones, and he compared them to the great fairy stories. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, in a good way. It was like, and I think if you look at a lot of great crime novels, they're a little bit, it's a bit like Brothers Grimm. And I think those are the conventions, rather than the bullshit conventions that people believe attached to the genre. I mean, there is one, I think, really, but it's kind of, it's there for the help of the writer, really, which is that, it's very hard to have a protagonist who's happily married, I've found. Because, I mean, in a sense, if you've got a wife at home in the book, it means he's always got to be home, He's got to get home at 5 o'clock, and explain to the wife where he's been and sort of mundane stuff like that. And that's not going to work, I don't think. And also, you're going to eliminate a sort of potential source of romance, intrigue, a dangerous woman. I mean, Bernie has a habit of picking women who are much more intelligent than him, and gets into trouble for that reason. I mean, it's kind of how I feel myself, I mean, I'm always attracted to women who are much more intelligent than I am, which is probably most of them, really.
You make him a widower, which gives him quite a sort of good.
Pathetic.
No, what's the right metaphor? Not alibi, but I mean, it means he is a sort of nice married man, and fate has trampled on that.
Yes.
And so now he can have
reason
affairs with actresses.
It's another reason for him to feel sorry for himself. Yes. Well, yeah. So that's for me. That's about the one convention that I pay any attention to, because I mean it's a tradition. You're told it's a tradition of a lot of crime writing that the status quo should be re-established at the end of the book. Well, that never happens in my book, because the status quo can't be established, because the crime of the millennia is still occurring. He may have worked out on the small scale of what happened was this, but the status quo is a different status quo. It's not a moral status quo that's restored. So that's one area where I feel that the normal rules of crime writing apply. But I mean, this is the reason why I mentioned fairy stories is because I think the great thing about fairy stories is because these are proper stories with a beginning and a middle and an end, quite often in that order as well. But the trouble with the novel today, especially the sort of, shall we say, the literary novel, is that story is a kind of unfashionable concept. You've got a plot. Why do you want one of those? I mean, everybody's trying to experiment with the form, and I've never been particularly good at experimenting with the form. I've tried it a few times and failed. I'm quite happy to sort of think of what I write as a kind of fairy story for grown-ups, really, which just means it's, I'm then qualified to write for children as well.
I'm thinking about those two things that you're talking about, plot, and then just before that, burn his women. In the most recent novel, in The Lady from Zagreb, I'm not giving anything away because I'm talking about how it begins, not how it ends. You actually, at the beginning, tell us how it ends, in a way. You use a prologue, and in parentheses, it's amazing how many good crime novels begin with a prologue. Sorry, I just throw that out. Crime novelists love prologues, labeled prologue. And in this prologue, which is 14 years later than the main action of the novel, we find out that he's not going to eventually get the girl. So you've already, everything that happens after that between him and her, we know that, however many or few lovely afternoons he has with her, in the end, he's not going to get her. So you've decided that in advance, haven't you?
I may have decided it, but I think life decides it as well. I mean, I don't think love and happiness ever sit well together anyway, certainly not in fiction.
Not for detectives.
No. But also I believe that sometimes the resolution to stories occurs a long time after, and so I like sort of to use a device like that, if only because it means that you can say, well, actually a long time has passed and since this happened, and because I think that's kind of how life is, really. And I mean, nothing is resolved. It's only on television that sort of stories get sort of resolved, within the hour, as it were, which makes it kind of inherently unbelievable, really. I mean, the great thing about a novel is that you can take your time, and it seems more probable, that a year or so or 2 years can pass. I mean, I did one where there was a 22-year gap between the beginning of the story and the end, which seemed fair to me, because, I mean, the older I get, quite frankly, the less amount of time 22 years actually seems. So.
And I mean, I must throw it open in a moment to our audience, but I wondered another aspect, what part the beginning and ending have in another aspect of, related to another aspect of crime writing, which is implicit in your Bernie Gunter novels, in some of the novels that Val writes, in what that Conan Doyle chap did, which is series. That, one thing about the detective that is important is that he or she, it seems in TV as well as in books, takes us through, reassuringly in a way, because they're going to survive, through these series. And I wonder, I know there was a big gap between the third of your Bernie Gunters and then you coming back to it. I wonder how, just technically, the thought that you are writing in a series has influenced the way that you make your plots and where you leave your character at the end of them?
Well, I mean, if I was going to do it again, I wouldn't squander the period so early. I mean, the first book started in 1936, and I think, oh, blimey, the Nazis had been in power for 3 years by then. I mean, I wasted 3 years by doing that. I mean, writing a series character, yeah, it's both a gift and a kind of curse at the same time. I mean, I wrote 3 of these in a row, and then I stopped and did other stuff, which, you know, frankly, a lot of it was a failure. I mean, I think your failures inform your successes if you're clever. I think failure is something never admitted by most artists, writers. But I mean, you have to write a few duds every so often to get it out of your system. Really, I do. I'm just not going to tell you which ones they are. I stopped doing, after 3 I stopped because I thought, well, you know what, I mean, I didn't become a writer just to write the same thing, the same character again and again. I'd like to be the sort of thing you say to yourself when you're young. I thought, well, I want to be like Kubrick, you know, I want to take the pictures that come to me, you know, one's not necessarily like the last one. I mean, if you look at, you've got Strangelove, then you've got 2001, then you've got Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon. They're all incredibly different. And I thought, well, that's kind of how I want to write books. And so I went through this period of about 10 years when everything I did was different, which was hell for the publisher. Hell, because they have got no idea what you're going to write next, and it becomes very hard to market you. And so now I sort of, publishing is so much harder now, it's more difficult for publishers. So I sort of feel, you know, I owe it to them to sort of try and give them a little bit of something that they recognize as being a little bit like the one before. But I don't do that, I try and do that in a way that leaves me satisfied as well, because otherwise, you know, you're just doing Big Mac publishing, really, or cookie cutting. You know, one book is exactly the same as the last one. So I mean, that's one reason why I've got a character in Bernie Gunther who you never know what period you're going to be in. I just think, or where he is going to be. So he's a bit like the Flying Dutchman in that respect, really.
So do you sometimes deliberately surprise a reader whom you presume has read the previous novels? Are you aware that there's a Bernie Gunther fan website? Well, there's probably several, and there are certainly, when the next book comes out, there are certainly people who'll read it who've read all the previous ones. And do you think of that reader, or do you and sort of surprise them or trick them, or are they not in your mind?
It's best not to think about them, because if you start thinking about giving people what they want, then you're not going to have the opportunity to fail, which I think, again, is important. You have to take risks. You're not going to take a risk if you're mindful of what people are looking for, what they want. So for me, it's important just to sort of do what I want to do. Equally, I sort of find new things out all the time, and I sort of think, well, how can I use this and fit it into what I've already done? See, another thing that I like to do is, it's the tradition of the unreliable narrator, which is a great literary tradition. You see, the character, we've only got his word for what he's really done. And, you know, occasionally I sort of put a little hint in that actually he may have done something, you know, really, you know, that he's really not proud of at all. He might even have committed a crime, you know, and occasionally he does actually murder people. And so, you know, I sort of think, that sort of keeps the reader on the toes anyway. But also, I mean, my own grandfather, who was in the First World War, was, you know, like the original unreliable narrator of all time, because we spent our entire lives as children believing that he joined the 1st Battalion of Cameron Highlanders, all volunteers, he used to say. And then I discovered only about a year ago that on the day his brother was killed at the Battle of Ypres, he put in for a transfer to the Royal Army Medical Corps. And he spent the next 3.5 years without a break ferrying bodies across no man's land. And he never spoke about it. It was almost like he regarded it as some sort of shameful thing. And I still don't understand why. You know, to me it seems like heroic that your brother's dead and you think, I've had enough of this killing. I'm going to devote myself now to helping people. But so I say an unreliable narrator, and I love this idea, which is especially useful when you've got a first-person narrative, which is to say, you know, well, I'm telling you this, but you know, and you're reading it, but how do you know that what parts of this are actually true?
So there's a new Bernie Gunter novel, isn't there, coming out? It's created already.
Yeah, it's
Don't make him happily married or anything like that, will you? I remember the terrible moment when the television adapters of Inspector Morse decided to give him a girlfriend who didn't die, or you know, and I was just completely, and they were perfectly happy together, and I was.
And they've done a terrible thing now. They just produced Mrs. Mannering in the new Dad's Army film. You know, and you think, oh, that's a stupid thing. I mean, for 30 years, Mrs. Mannering only ever existed at home, you know, but they've suddenly produced Mrs. Mannering, actually, so you've taken a good joke away.
We got probably past the stage where I should give everybody else here a chance. I don't know if do we have microphones? Or yes, we have. And microphone, people with microphones. So if anybody would like to...
Where Ruth Rendell used to say, and now we'll have some sensible questions.
Yes.
From the audience, with the accent on sensible, and so people would sort of like shrinkingly sort of start to put their hand up. And I remember Ruth saying to the first poor person who's asked a question at Hey on Why when I was sitting with her, and she said, "Oh, that's not a sensible question. Next!" And the poor guy just sort of shrank in his chair, you know. So let's have some
The
questions.
worst one ever was I was interviewing Donna Tartt, and somebody asked her a question she didn't like, and she just went like this. Everybody thought for the first sort of 30 seconds that sort of, you know, she got something stuck in her throat or something, and she just remained completely silent because she didn't. But we're not going to do that.
Yes, I've got a question. After reading all the Bernie Gunter novels, I read research, and I wondered how much of the real life of a super writer is in there. Is it actually, you know, is your life like that, or do you employ plenty of graduates who do all your work for you? And
Well, I was fascinated with. I won't mention his name, but you know, there are a couple of writers who just think of the plots, and then they employ other people to go and write them.
Who are these people?
Well, James Patterson is one, and I just thought it was fascinating. You know, this idea that you would have it's like a kind of artist's atelier, and you would just come in and put the maestro's flourishes on the canvas, as it were, and then leave your studio painters to knock out the actual canvas. And so that was really, it was just the idea of that sort of fascinated me. I mean, obviously there are lots of things that I've drawn on my own experience. I mean, you know, it's for me, it was just a chance to make some unpleasant jokes about publishing and other writers, really. Which, if you read it, you'll see what they are. I mean, you know, I wish my life was as fun as his, actually. But I mean, those two characters. It's about a guy who works for a sort of super rich, famous writer who actually writes the novels that the other guy has plotted, and every few months he hands him a new plot and says, "Yep, there you are. Go off you go, and here's $40,000 and write it." And it was just fun to do. I mean, I don't know whether it succeeded or not. I had a great time writing it, I must say. But, I mean, in a way, sometimes I look at things I've had a great time writing and think, well, yeah, maybe it wasn't that good, I don't know. I mean, the writer's usually the last person in the world to find out whether he thinks it's any good or not. Another sensible question? I always used to get asked, and I know we all writers, we get asked this, which is, where do you get your ideas from? In America, you get a lot of these ones. And I jokingly used to answer, well, actually, I subscribe to a magazine called Plots Unlimited. And it contains, you buy it it's a monthly magazine, and it contains 50 or 60 plots, and if you use one, you pay a commission to the magazine. And a few people in the audience, like you, laughed and got the joke. And at the end, this guy came up to me and he said, where can I buy the magazine? But the joke was on me, because it turns out that there is a piece of software in America you can buy, which is called, I think it's not called Plots Unlimited, but it's something like that. And it contains 40,000 different plots that you can just take out as you please, you know. So,
Yes.
I have a question. There are people who write about the Holocaust, about the Nazis, who've been accused of producing Holocaust kitsch or pornography. And I can think of examples where I think it's justified. How do you avoid that as a writer?
Well, I try. One thing I've had a scene in Dachau, because Dachau wasn't a death camp. So I've sort of been very careful about writing about this. You're aware there's a kind of huge sensitivity about it. And so for instance, I was going to write about this place, Jasenovac, which wasn't a death camp, it was a murder camp. And I felt the justification was the very fact that hardly anybody knew about it. Certainly, there were very few Yugoslavs who knew about it. And indeed, the little housing estate that is built in Jasenovac, on the edge of Jasenovac, I sort of wonder how many of the people there knew about it. You know, if you're looking out your kitchen making a cup of tea, and you can see the camp at the end of the road, as it were. So I felt, sometimes I think, if people don't know about something, that's the justification. Because as well as wanting to tell a good story, I feel, to some extent, I'm also trying to educate and keep the story alive. Because it's not just it's not just history books that are going to keep this subject alive. It has to be fiction too. So that's really my justification to myself. But equally, I'm terribly careful about doing it. I mean, I think that it's almost like you have to kind of tell yourself beforehand that these are the rules, and remember that you can't play fast and loose with something like this. I did a script for it was a German film company, actually, and it was about the Munich Post, which was the only consistent source of opposition to Adolf Hitler until the Nazis were elected. And there was very little known about it. And consequently, it meant I had to take one or two people who were real people and mix them in with some fictional people. And the producer said to me, well, can't this person have a romance with that person? I said, well, no, because I don't know. I mean, these are made-up characters. These ones are all made up, and these ones are true. And what we're actually trying to get here is a greater story. It's not like we're interested in the romance between a fictional character and a real character, which is a shame, because it was a wonderful story. And just to let you in on this, what made it really interesting was that the paper somehow had a deep throat, an informer in the Hitler camp who kept giving them scoops. And it drove Hitler nuts, absolutely nuts. And the first thing he did when he came to power was close the paper and arrest everyone and throw them in jail. Many of them died. Their biggest scoop, which they ran in, I think it was probably November 1932, and it was called, headline, The Final Solution. And I felt that on its own justified the whole film. And the story was this: they had everything. They said, when the Nazis come to power, this is what they have in mind for the Jews of Germany and Europe. They will be forbidden to practice medicine, dentistry. They'll be taken out of government. They'll be eliminated from all the professions. Eventually, their wealth will be confiscated. And then they will be sent, quotes, to the swamps of Eastern Europe where disease, malnutrition will take care of them. That was 1932. The journalists who published this story had had it for weeks, but they didn't publish it because they thought no one would believe it. And so they did publish it, and many of their previous stories had been taken up by the international press. That one wasn't. But that to me seemed to justify the entire film. But like I say, I couldn't feel comfortable mixing on that occasion real characters with fictional characters. Some of them did survive. In fact, one of them founded the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. So they did survive. One there.
Yes.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Rupesh. It's really great to be at such a fantastic event. My question is, do you ever find that you have a time frame for your novels? Do you ever feel like there's a pressure by which point you have to complete it, or are you quite free in terms of writing your novels?
Well, I'm that really irritating creature, which is that I haven't a clue what my deadlines are, because I'd always be well in advance of them anyway. There are two kinds of writers, you see. There are inspirationals and there are compulsives. And I'm a compulsive. In fact, there was a French television crew came to my house recently, and they started filming in my study, and they looked at all the books I'd published on my shelf, and they said, "Oh gosh, you must feel terribly proud." And I looked at them and I thought, actually, now I come to think of it, it looks kind of like an obsessive compulsive disorder. I feel compelled to do this. I felt compelled to do this since the age of 10, growing up in Edinburgh. And I don't ever feel that I'm under pressure. The only pressure I feel is the kind of pressure from life and melancholy and pessimism and shit like that. In a way, I take refuge in my books because I don't feel I'm entirely suited to life. Failed in life, become a writer. That's kind of. I mean, there is something weird and strange about being a writer, I feel. I apologize to my fellow writers at this point. They're obviously not weird and strange people, but I feel I am, because I feel sometimes it's the difference between a real life and a written life. It's a life that I've spent years just making up, absenting myself from normal life and society. And it just, to me now, it's begun to look like, as I say, a kind of strange little obsession that it's sort of, I mean, there are worse things that you could do, in terms of obsession, but I mean, I'm being really honest here.
So you're like Dr. Johnson said of Richard Savage, having no other resources, he became of necessity an author.
Totally. I mean, I actually, when I did get published, I'd run out of. I really didn't know what I was going to do if I didn't get published, because I'd blown so many good careers. I'd blown being a lawyer. I'd blown being a an account executive in an advertising agency. I'd blown being a copywriter. I'd blown being an accountant. I'd blown being a television executive. Even managed somehow to blow being a journalist, you know. So, I mean, I don't know what would have happened to me if I hadn't become a writer. I probably would have robbed that payroll, actually, and been living in South America.
Have we got somebody else put up? There was another hand up next to the aisle. Yes? Oh, yes.
I have a question about language. Your characters speak English, even though they are Germans. Then your novels become translated, and suddenly they speak German. Can you talk about that transformation, how you source them, how they sound to you? Do they speak English to you, or do they sort of speak English or German that magically is your language?
Well, no, I spend a lot of time working this out because I try and get the ear of how people speak in German. So, I mean, instead of offering equivalent translations, I try and look for a more literal translation so that it sort of stands out a bit in English. I mean, I was just speaking, we were talking about this earlier, you know, the fantastic ability of the German language to sort of bolt on words to itself. In England, we just borrow words from other languages, borrow a lot of words from, you know, the Indian language, for instance. But in German, you have this fantastic, what you call it, a Danube steam captain word, you know, which is fantastic in itself, a Danube steam captain word. So I spend a lot of time with an enormous German dictionary looking for little words that have no obvious translation in English to try and find an equivalent so that it seems, you know, I mean, for instance, you know, Germans call, we would say, if we were going to be speaking in a derogatory way about someone who was mentally impaired, we would say he was a loony, short for lunatic. Well, you say spinner. Now, spinner, to me, if you're going to, spinner sounds much better because it's not loony. If you're going to put loony in it in a novel which is set in Berlin, it's just not going to sound like it's set in Berlin. So spinner, for instance, or, I mean, the cops used to be called bulls, and cigarettes were called nails and stuff like that. So I love all that stuff. And to me, those are the little snippets, the tiny little bits of dialogue that make the whole thing sort of come alive a bit, really. And the jokes as well. I mean, the German jokes, sometimes very hard to translate, you know. But it's kind of worth working at, because when you do actually get a translation that you are really happy with, then it almost sounds like you've made it up yourself, actually. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it makes me realise that one of the other challenges of writing historical, or perhaps all historical novels, but certainly historical thrillers or crime mysteries, is that you have to write dialogue which doesn't, without sounding as though it's antique, doesn't sound as though it's being spoken now in a way. And I mean, do you have do you sort of have a sieve, a mental sieve of words and phrases which can't go, you know, people in I don't know if it's a vice people indulge in Germany, but in Britain there's this ghastly program called Downton Abbey. And one of the sports which I confess I've indulged in is to spot the anachronisms in the dialogue. And because people spend the whole time in Downton Abbey saying, "Look at you." And then people write letters to the Times Literary Supplement saying, well, in fact, the phrase "look at you" used in that way was first used in 1893 you in whose army, you know, and it turns out these things are all older. But they perhaps don't always try very hard in the scripts of those, but you presumably do have a kind of sieving.
Well, yeah, I mean, Martin Amis talks about the war against cliché, and in a way, one is waging a similar war in these books, because, you know, reaching for the easy phrase is not how it's going to work. And so invariably, I've thought of an easy phrase, a cliche, and then I will go to something in German and then find something which works better, and then the whole thing comes alive that way. But yeah, you're right.
That's the first time you've told me I'm right this evening, Philip. I feel we're getting quite a rapport here.
We've got another question here.
Yeah, where are we? Thank you.
Thank you for this great talk. I'd like to ask a question about the educational dimension of fiction writing. Do you see a difference between historical texts and fiction when it comes to carrying knowledge to next generations? And if not, does that create a nervousness, a sort of obligation when you construct history through fiction? Thank you.
I'll make this, I can see people have had enough really, so I'll make this the last question, I think. Yeah, I think there's a huge obligation. First of all, historians hate what people like me do, because they are limited by the history. When I run out of history, I can work between the lines of history and do this awful thing that historians are not allowed to do, which is called speculate. But at the same time, I don't take liberties with the facts. I mean, for instance, I will go to the extent of, if I'm writing within a period and a place and a time, I'll try and find out exactly what was happening. So, for instance, when I was writing about Goebbels, it was very useful to have Goebbels' diaries, so you can find out where Goebbels was on a certain day. And so I think I don't cheat. I hate cheating in the context of what I do, because I think, that's the job. The job is to try and get it right as often as possible. And sometimes when you have to work within the established facts, you have to work that little bit harder to find an explanation or a way of getting what you want to happen to actually happen. So the obligation I feel is I don't like to, for instance, make one character say something that he wouldn't have said, or do something that he probably wouldn't have done. So that means an awful lot of work. That's the writer's job, I think, really, is to, you make mistakes, I make mistakes, and people will write to you and point out, as somebody did the other day, that I'd written about a 2-story tram in Munich, and in fact the trams in Munich were only 1 story at that particular time. So yeah, it's a useful correction, somebody actually put pen to paper to tell you that. But I will go to the extent of, would you believe I spent a whole morning trying to find the brand name of an oil filter from 1939. Because, as I say, I think that's your job. Your job is to try and get it right. If you're going to write about something like that, then you have to get it right. Can I just say thank you very much to John, because people never thank their interlocutor in front of everyone else.
Well, I was about to thank you.
Yeah, I know, but I'm doing it first.
No, the convention is I get the last word, and I do the thanking. You made me embarrassed. So I'm sure you would all want
That's
me.
why I gave you a bottle of vodka as well,
Yes, I had to ask a very kind person who hung up my coat to be careful, because there was a bottle of vodka in it. I've never said that sentence. I know all those English words that forms that sentence. Isn't language a miracle? But I've never said the sentence before, be careful of my coat, there's a bottle of vodka in the pocket. I think Chomsky has something to say about that. But anyway, I'm sure you'd all want me to thank Philip for being so forthcoming and indefatigable, and he's now liberated you, so I think we'll all want to say thanks to him.